It is October 27th, 1962. A Soviet submarine sits silent and suffocating beneath the Caribbean Sea. The water temperature inside the B-59 has climbed past 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew has not received radio contact from Moscow in 3 days. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, believes World War III has already started above him. He orders the preparation of the nuclear torpedo, one weapon, 10 kilotons, enough to vaporize an American naval vessel and trigger a retaliatory strike that ends civilization. We think the world almost ended that day because of ideology, because of two systems that hated each other, because of missiles in Cuba and soldiers at checkpoints. That is the story they teach in schools. It is wrong. The world almost ended that October because of a balance sheet, because two superpowers had each borrowed so heavily from their own futures to fund an arms race neither could afford. That rational decision-making had been slowly strangled by financial desperation for nearly 2 decades. Nuclear war does not begin with a button. It begins with a ledger that has run out of room. This is the story nobody tells about nuclear conflict. The real story. The one written in Treasury documents, defense appropriations, and currency collapse. The story of how bankruptcy and insolvency do not just destroy economies. They destroy the world. To understand how nuclear war begins, you first have to understand what the world looked like before the countdown started. Stand in Red Square on May 9, 1945, the day of the Soviet victory parade, and feel the scale of what had been built. The Red Army was the largest ground force in human history, more than 11 million soldiers under arms. Soviet industry had produced over 100,000 tanks during the war alone. Steel poured from furnaces in the Urals around the clock. The Soviet state had survived Hitler. It had absorbed 27 million dead and emerged from the rubble as a continental empire stretching from Berlin to the Pacific. The gold reserves were modest but growing. The territory was vast beyond comprehension. The population was hardened. The ideology was galvanizing. That it would never be enough. Not until Moscow had a bomb that could reach Washington. The Soviets detonated their first nuclear device on August 29, 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima. The American monopoly on atomic terror was over, and at that precise moment, the most expensive arms race in human history opened its ledger and began writing numbers that would eventually consume both empires. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The rot had a specific name. It was called the defense burden, and it worked like a slow hemorrhage that no surgeon could stop. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union was allocating between 15 and 17% of its entire GDP to military spending. Not to schools, not to bread, not to the housing that millions of Soviet citizens still desperately needed. To missiles and submarines and bombers and the nuclear warheads that sat atop them, waiting. Compare that to the United States, which was spending roughly 10% of GDP at its Cold War peak on a GDP that was 3 times the size of the Soviet one. The arithmetic was brutal. The Soviets were running twice as hard on half the track. This was the addiction. This was the trap that snapped shut in slow motion across 4 decades. The monster was not a foreign general or an American president. The monster had an office in Moscow on Staraya Plощad Street. By 1980, it employed an estimated 12 million workers. It controlled the best engineers, the best steel, the best computing power the Soviet system could produce. Consumer goods were starved. Agriculture was underfunded. The ruble, officially pegged at an artificial rate that bore no relationship to reality, was a currency that told lies every single day. The Soviet state was not just spending beyond its means. It was spending beyond the means of a system that had never been designed to be honest about its means in the first place. The true antagonist in this story is not a missile. It is an oil price. Specifically, it is what happened on the crude oil market starting in 1985 and accelerating catastrophically through 1986. Oil exports were the lifeblood of the Soviet treasury. By the early 1980s, they accounted for roughly 60% of all Soviet hard currency earnings. 60%. The entire Soviet war machine, the entire nuclear arsenal, the entire global chess game of the Cold War, all of it was being funded by oil sold at world market prices in U.S. dollars. In 1980, oil was trading at approximately $30 per barrel, enough to keep the machine alive, enough to service the debts, enough to pretend the ruble had value. Then Saudi Arabia opened its taps. By the summer of 1986, oil had collapsed to under $10 per barrel. The Soviet treasury did not bleed. It hemorrhaged. Think about the scale of that. In 18 months, the primary funding mechanism for the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal lost 2/3 of its value. The Soviet Union had not been attacked by a single missile. It had not lost a single soldier in a major engagement. It had simply watched the price of oil fall on a commodity exchange in New York, and the entire financial architecture of a nuclear superpower had begun to buckle under its own weight. Now the descent begins in earnest in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev took power. Soviet foreign debt stood at approximately $22.5 billion. Uncomfortable, but manageable. By 1989, it had climbed to $54 billion as the state frantically borrowed from Western banks to cover the gap left by collapsing oil revenues. By 1991, foreign debt had reached $67 billion, and the Soviet Union was unable to make scheduled interest payments to its creditors. Not unwilling, unable, the largest nuclear power on Earth was technically insolvent. The gold reserves, once a point of national pride, had been drained. In 1953, the Soviet Union held approximately 2,500 tons of gold in its state reserves. By 1991, that number had fallen to just 240 tons. They had sold the gold to buy time. The time had run out. The shelves in Moscow stores were empty by the winter of 1990. Red lines stretched for hundreds of meters in cities that had once hosted military parades of breathtaking scale. The soldiers were still there. The missiles were still there. The lunch codes were still there, but the money was gone. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The shelves were bare. This is the exact moment when nuclear war becomes most likely, not when nations are strong, when they are desperate. When a government has promised its people security and prosperity and can deliver neither, when the generals are better funded than the farmers, when the nuclear button is the last symbol of power in a room full of bankruptcy notices. Now we come to the smoking gun, the document that truly explains how the nuclear countdown was engineered from the outside. It was signed by President Ronald Reagan on January 17, 1983. Its official designation was National Security Decision Directive 75. Known internally as NSDD-75, it was classified for over a decade. When it was finally declassified and examined in full, it read less like a foreign policy document and more like a corporate takeover strategy. NSDD-75 stated explicitly that the United States would pursue policies designed to reverse Soviet expansionism by exploiting the vulnerabilities of the Soviet system, particularly its economic weaknesses. It directed U.S. intelligence agencies and economic planners to coordinate pressure on Soviet hard currency earnings. It explicitly identified oil prices as a strategic lever. It called for accelerating the arms race, specifically to force Soviet defense spending to levels that the Soviet economy could not sustain. Think about what you are reading. This was not a military plan. This was a liquidation strategy, written in the language of national security, but operating on the logic of a hostile corporate acquisition. The intent was to force a competitor into insolvency by running up their costs faster than their revenue could grow. It was a foreclosure, dressed in the language of freedom. The conversations in those closed rooms were not about missiles and warheads. They were about debt service ratios and commodity prices. American officials essentially said, if we can keep their defense costs high and their oil revenues low, the ledger breaks before the missiles fly. They were right, and they were also playing with the most dangerous variable in human history, because a nuclear power that knows it is losing economically does not necessarily surrender gracefully. Sometimes it reaches for the one card that cannot be trumped. That moment came closer than most people will ever know. On September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at a monitoring station called Serpukhov 15, south of Moscow. The Soviet early warning system, a system built on borrowed time and underfunded technology, a system that was itself a product of a defense budget stretched past breaking, reported an incoming American missile strike, then a second missile, then a third, fourth, and fifth. The computer system insisted this was a genuine first strike. Protocol was clear. Report to superiors. Initiate retaliatory launch. Do not hesitate. Petrov hesitated. He looked at the data. He knew the system was unreliable. He had watched budgets cut corners on the very sensors he was trusting with his life and everyone else's. He made a unilateral decision. He reported it as a false alarm. He was correct. A software glitch in a sun-reflecting satellite had been misread as incoming warheads. The Soviet response was never launched. The world never knew how close it had come. But here is the economic truth underneath that moment. The maintenance was underfunded because the oil revenues had fallen and the defense budget. The near miss of September 1983 was not a technological failure, it was a fiscal failure. The bankruptcy of the Soviet state very nearly triggered a nuclear response to a ghost. Sovereignty is solvency. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered. The Soviet state, which had spent an estimated $8 trillion in today's dollars on its military over 4 decades, which had built over 40,000 nuclear warheads at its peak, which had sacrificed the bread and housing and prosperity of 3 generations of its people to fund a nuclear arsenal designed to ensure its survival. That state simply ceased to exist. Not from invasion, not from nuclear exchange, from insolvency. The social consequences were not cinematic. They were administrative. Pension payments stopped for an estimated 40 million Soviet retirees. The savings accounts of ordinary citizens denominated in rubles were wiped out by hyperinflation that peaked at 2,500% in Russia in 1992. Hospitals ran out of basic medications. The infant mortality rate climbed. Male life expectancy in Russia fell from 64 years in 1990 to 57 years by 1994. 7 years erased from the life expectancy of an entire generation of men, not by bombs, but by the cold arithmetic of a collapsed economic system that had been mortgaged to build weapons it could never use, and those weapons did not disappear. They scattered, they proliferated. Nuclear material from former Soviet stockpiles turned up in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus. Some of it was sold, some of it was lost, some of it entered the black market in quantities that still keep intelligence agencies awake at night. The bankruptcy of the Soviet state did not just destroy the Soviet people's savings. It created the single greatest proliferation risk in the history of nuclear weapons. The weapons built to protect a state outlived the state by decades and went looking for new owners. The generational wound cut across every nation touched by the Cold War arms race. The United States, which had spent an estimated $6.4 trillion on its own nuclear program between 1940 and 1996, a figure calculated by the Brookings Institution in their landmark study, faced its own reckoning. That $6.4 trillion did not include the cost of conventional forces, the intelligence apparatus, or the foreign aid dispersed to keep allies from drifting toward Moscow. The total economic cost of the Cold War to the United States alone has been estimated at over $8 trillion in period dollars. The U.S. debt grew from approximately $260 billion in 1950 to $4 trillion by 1992. The arms race was financed in significant part on borrowed money, and that borrowing cast a shadow on every American generation that followed. The final interest payments on Cold War-era debt are still being written today. Russia, the inheritor of the Soviet debt, formally settled its outstanding Soviet-era obligations to Western creditors only in August 2017. Think about that. The financial consequences of the Cold War arms race, a race that began in earnest in 1949, were not fully settled until 2017. 68 years of compound interest, of renegotiated schedules, of partial payments and deferrals. The last check from the Soviet nuclear gamble was written by people who were not yet born when the first Soviet bomb detonated in the Kazakh steppe. That is how long the ledger stays open. That is how long the debt of nuclear competition follows a nation like a shadow that never fully lifts. And now consider the world today. There are approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads in existence across 9 countries. The annual global cost of maintaining those arsenals is estimated at $82.4 billion, nearly $1 trillion per decade. North Korea spends an estimated 25% of its entire GDP on its military, while its population lives on rationed bread. Pakistan developed its nuclear capability while running near bankruptcy, famously eating grass to fund the bomb, in the words of its own prime minister. Every nation that has reached for the nuclear option has done so not from a position of strength, but from a position of economic fear. Not because they were powerful, because they were terrified of being poor and powerless in a world that respects neither. Nuclear war does not begin in a war room. It begins the moment a government looks at its balance sheet and realizes that conventional deterrence is too expensive to maintain. It begins when the oil price falls below a critical threshold and the Treasury starts making impossible choices. It begins when a defense minister tells a president that they can no longer guarantee the reliability of their early warning systems because the maintenance budget was cut 3 years in a row. It begins when sanctions squeeze a nuclear-armed government until the only remaining source of leverage is the weapon itself. The minute-by-minute countdown to nuclear war is not measured in seconds on a clock. It is measured in months of declining GDP and quarters of falling reserves, in years of compounding debt that gradually closes off every option except the most extreme one. By the time a president sits in a bunker considering a launch order, the financial decision that made that moment possible was made 10, 20, 30 years earlier by an accountant in a budget meeting over a line item that nobody thought was important enough to fight for. Every week, this channel tears open another chapter of history and finds the ledger they tried to hide. The numbers that explain everything. Because the people who understand where the money went are always the last ones to be surprised by what comes next. Hit subscribe. Leave a comment below. Tell me, which number in this story changed the way you think about nuclear weapons? Because once you see the economics, you cannot see the missiles the same way again? Cold Open. Opens October 27th, 1962. B-59 submarine, Savitsky, nuclear torpedo. Debunks ideology narrative. Introduces balance sheet, ledger, insolvency framing immediately. Illusion of Majesty, Red Square Victory Parade, 1945. 11 million soldiers, 100,000 tanks, Soviet industrial empire. Century details of gold, steel, power. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting.